Hello, everyone. I'm Carl Silverstein, Executive Director of Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. I want to welcome you to our webinar on building inclusive environmental programming. We'll take a couple of minutes while folks join the webinar, and then we'll get started. We'll just wait a couple of minutes as folks sign on, and then we'll begin. Well, again, welcome to our webinar on building inclusive environmental programming. My name is Carl Silverstein. I'm Executive Director of Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, and I'm thrilled to introduce LaKyla Hodges, who is our panelist for today. LaKyla serves as the Equity and Education Manager with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, and she focuses on connecting communities to nature and addressing inequities in access to green space. LaKyla is a graduate of Warren Wilson College, and in her role, she partners with a number of groups in the area: Everybody's Environment, the Coalition for Outdoor Renaming and Education, and Pathways to Parks. LaKyla also serves as the Western Section Chair for Environmental Educators of North Carolina. So as we have the webinar today, we want to acknowledge that this is a time of great pressure on people and communities and equity. And SAHC has worked hard to build up our program in this area and to make it a foundational principle of our work. So we want to lean into what's right, and appreciate your being part of the webinar today. With that, happy to introduce LaKyla.
All right, thank you, Carl, and thank you all for joining. As Carl said, today we're going to be talking about building inclusive environmental programming. Just a brief overview today, we're going to go over some historical aspects of inclusivity in the environmental field. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about some real life scenarios of my own and that colleagues have given me permission to share, to talk about some challenges that come with inclusive environmental programming and how to overcome them. I cannot currently see the chat, but I will be encouraging you all to comment in the chat just so you can interact with each other and have a greater understanding and more perspectives about the topics we're going to go over today. So we can go ahead and jump right in. First, starting off with the KWL as an educator, what you want to know, what you know, and what you want to learn can be a big driving theme when you're doing lessons. And so in the chat, if you're comfortable, you can just share your first name, where you work, and one thing you'd like to learn today. I also will be having some inclusion tips on some of these slides. They'll be at the bottom, so you all can keep up with some of the themes that are going to go through this presentation. And at the end of this program, I'll also share 10 of some of my favorite inclusion strategies as an educator. Starting off with why I personally care about inclusivity environmental field, and also hopefully why you do as well. Starting off with the research, there's extensive research supporting the fact that people of color and from low-income backgrounds lack positive experiences in nature. Environmental accessibility is also very difficult for people who are differently abled, seniors, and people with exceptionalities. And there are many physical and mental benefits to spending time in nature. There is a graphic on this screen that is specifically about kids spending time in nature, but it's something that really relates to anyone and everyone. I'm sure everyone on this Zoom call is very familiar with how hard accessibility can be in the outdoors, whether it be a monetary barrier or a physical barrier. Even living and working here in Asheville, I've met lots of people of all ages from all different types of background who've never been to Mount Mitchell or never taken a hike off of the Blue Ridge Parkway. So there's really a various amount of things that can keep you from having experiences, whether they be positive or negative in the outdoors. There are also lots of many different reasons that people of color and from low income backgrounds avoid nature or lack those experiences. There's obviously a historical aspect. Environmental conservation today lacks a lot of inclusivity, but this is not something new, right? In the beginnings of environmental origins, there's no people of color, there are no women, and there are very, very few low-income people who are a part of those deep, rich histories in terms of what we see today as environmental conservation, the beginnings of the park services and things like that. It was not an inclusive world. We've got a photo on screen from 1903 of John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, and a couple of others in what would eventually become Yosemite National Park. And you can just see in this image that it's all white men from higher income backgrounds. These historical and generational cultural experiences stretch across the board for all different types of people. For example, migrant farm workers are 20 times as likely to die of heat stroke than other US workers. Black Americans often have strong historical feelings about farms, swamps, woods, and the outdoors in general. And several indigenous communities have traumatic cultural and historical memories of the outdoors. These are all historical examples, but again, they connect to today. I've been involved in the outdoors, whether it be a recreational sense or a personal sense, for as long as I can remember. And I still get warnings from family members when I'm talking about upcoming programs or events, about what could happen to us out there, and knowing that I need to be more careful and more cautious than others might be when I'm going out into the outdoors. This obviously has a negative effect on access in the outdoors. So even folks who might have the financial means and be physically close to green spaces would still have deterrence to going out into nature and enjoying themselves and becoming more comfortable in the outdoors because of these deep-seated historical and cultural issues. Looking at a National Park Service study, they found that about 78% of visitors to US national parks were white, 80% of National Park Service employees were white, and about 8% of visitors to the National Park Service identified as Black. And in a lot of these surveys, when you're looking at statistics about the outdoors and who goes outside, it is typically, when you're looking at racial minorities, Black people are the largest minority who participate in these. So with 8% of visitors being Black, you can only imagine that the number goes down from there with different people of color. And that same year, 2018, people of color made up about 42% of the US population. So there's obviously a statistical anomaly that shows that there is a clear problem that's not just evident to someone who might be a person of color and have that experience of not seeing people who look like them, or people who are older or have disabilities, not being able to see other people like them in the outdoors. These are also supported by real statistics from the Park Service. Even in places like Asheville, this is really common. I myself and lots of different people in the area try to mitigate this issue by bringing the outdoors to people through education and providing low cost or no cost experiences in the outdoors. The photo here on screen is from this past summer, and it was from a hike that I was able to take a group from the Stevens Lee Community Center summer camp in Montreat. That is something that it was a very special day. And out of all of these kids featured in the photo, and there are even some off camera who didn't want to be in the photo, none of them had ever been to Montreat to take a hike. And for those of you who might not know, Montreat is a town maybe 20 minutes outside of Asheville proper. And over half of the participants, including the adults who were with them, had never even been on a hike, which is hard to wrap your mind around when you think about Asheville and when you think about how big of an industry the outdoors is and how big of a push there is to go out and go hiking and biking and kayaking and all of these other outdoor activities. And there's just often a huge overlooked population of people who either don't have the means to do it, or people who just don't have enough exposure to it to know how to get into these things, or even to know that they might even enjoy it. Here we have a graphic comparing neighborhood type to tree coverage. I love looking at graphics like this because I think it really helps take the abstract away from things like this. And so this is actually of the DC, Virginia area. And it's got a neighborhood type on the left, with dark green being wealthier neighborhoods and red being impoverished. And then on the right, you've got tree coverage, with dark blue being high tree coverage and the orange being low tree coverage. And you can see that there is a pretty heavy correlation between wealth and tree coverage. This is something that is true all across the United States, and it's actually a global phenomenon because people with higher income see the value in green spaces. So they know it's something that they want to have around them, whether they're people who are interested in native plants and land conservation, or people who just like to have topiary and a beautiful green lawn. There's value seen in this. And so you can go across the United States. If you look at large industrial areas, if you're looking at where the airports are, if you're looking at where the trash dumps are, no green space in those areas, and typically surrounded by low income folks. And if you go to these places and you're looking at where their parks might be, it is most often in wealthy neighborhoods. So again, this isn't something that is a big racial divide necessarily, just being white versus black and brown, but there also is a very heavy financial component to this. So even though this phenomenon is true all across the world and across the US, there are a lot of people who are working to find solutions to this, and a lot of people who are working to make these wealthy areas that are green spaces more open and inviting to people who aren't from those areas to be able to come and enjoy it as well. There is still discrimination in outdoor spaces. I personally have heard from a lot of people who are underrepresented in the outdoor field, who are still interested in it, that the outdoors is kind of a safe place for them, right? They go there to get away from the stress of everyday life, to get away from possible discrimination they may face. And still, things like this may follow them. Here on the screen, I've got a photo of Christian Cooper, who a lot of you are likely familiar with, who was a bird watcher who was accosted and had the police called on him in Central Park for just watching birds. Central Park being a huge public park that all types of people frequent on a daily basis year round. And this Black man with binoculars being singled out for looking at birds is something that I think shocked a lot of people and was very eye-opening to folks in the outdoor industry who think oh, well, maybe it's just people in those places. There's an ongoing narrative that it's really southern states and Midwestern states that are more conservative where people might face these issues, and that maybe it's easier in northern states and in California to get more into the outdoors and to be able to really start building community, inclusive communities in the outdoors. But that is not always the case. This is not a thing of the past. Now that we've gone over some historical context, we're going to actually start talking about planning outdoor events and partnering with different communities than your own. So when planning outdoor experiences, it's important to consider different perspectives. The photo I have here on the screen is me and a family friend on my first trip to Asheville. I think I was about 15 years old. And we knew that I was into the outdoors. We knew that I wanted to go to school in a place where I could have access to nature. That was pretty easy. And this family friend took us all around Asheville, showed us her favorite parks and things like this, and ended the day with telling us that there was a community garden where we could go and pick some fresh produce. What I didn't know at the time, because my experiences with community gardens have been in more urban areas, where it's like a city block and an undeveloped part of it gets turned into a community garden, right? This is something that is really common in cities in the US. She took me to a back road in Black Mountain, North Carolina, where it was just trees. There were no houses around. And she was like, yeah, we can just get out and we can just pick some things to take. This was something that made me really uncomfortable in the moment as a 15-year-old, knowing that I was a Black person in a very white community and not really feeling welcomed by the community just from driving through the area that we were in. And, she had in mind, I know LaKyla likes gardening. I know LaKyla likes community gardens. This would be a great thing for her to be able to see that this area has to offer for her. So you can see in the photo, we're smiling. It ended up being fine. I picked a lot of turnips, which I don't like, but was still fun. But it was really one of the first moments I had as a teenager where I realized that other people might have really good intentions, but not be able to consider different cultural perspectives. So as we plan environmental education experiences, how do we welcome and engage everyone? First thing we can do is consider some of the barriers with getting underrepresented groups to visit the outdoors. For example, why are many people unable or unwilling to visit national parks? You can respond in the chat if you're comfortable with some of your ideas of why this might be. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk about some ideas of why this might be. Partially here on the screen, I have a map of the US national parks. You can see that if you're familiar with US geography, they're not in places that are necessarily easily accessible or close to highly populated areas, right? And that's comes with the territory partially, right? Because if you have a national park, you want it to be a large piece of green space that's away from a cityscape, but also means that you have to be able to have a car who can make the drive to the national parks. And you have to be able to be comfortable knowing when you get there, you're going to have limited cell phone service. And for a lot of people who are underrepresented in the field, when you're going out here that you're not going to see a lot of people who may look like you. You might not feel a sense of community the way other people might. And so you have to think if you also want to be actually disconnected from your community and also from safety measures by taking a risk and going into these places far away from your home with limited cellular access. Those are just some examples. We've already gone over several others. Also thinking about, keep in mind, if you've been to one national park, or if you've been to 5, or if you've been to 10, this is something that a lot of people in our field kind of take for granted. We get a lot of excitement in checking national parks off of our bucket lists, and it's a beautiful experience and it's really fun to be able to do. But this is a unique experience. This is not something that the vast majority of people in the US get to do. Lots of people never visit a national park whether they would like to or not. It's just not something that is feasible, despite lots of different initiatives put into place. There's discounted parks passes. Lots of parks do free days or weeks or months during high visitation times. And there's still all types of barriers to being able to get into these spaces. This also leads to people not being able to solve these issues, right? If you can't get into the space, then you can't get into the room and you can't work on ways to make it better. So the National Park Service does a really great job at coming up with different initiatives to attract people out to the parks. But it's still extremely difficult to figure out what might be attractive or what might be best for groups that are underrepresented when you can't actually consult with the groups to figure out what would make them feel most comfortable. Here we have a strategy of thinking carefully when you're planning and doing an empathy walkthrough. Needs assessments have taken a big jump in the outdoor industry. People are always talking about needing to do a needs assessment before you partner with a community or an organization that is not your own. And I definitely agree with that. But within a needs assessment, I see a really big need for an empathy walkthrough, putting yourself into other people's shoes. So we've got a couple scenarios here. First one, we have an urban outdoor organization that's planning to take some kids to a hike at a plantation. A coordinator shares that the plantation rents out former slave houses and the kids can bunk there cheaply. She's extremely excited to share the history and nature with the students. Along with this, some more context is these students came from inner city Atlanta, so a predominantly Black population, and the coordinator who was suggesting this was a white person. So that's our first scenario. I'm going to read off the second one. A university does a first-year outdoor exploration trip. The group of 20 students will hike at a park, but first must drive an hour down Robert E. Lee Highway through a rural community where they will pass dozens of homes and businesses flying Confederate flags. In the chat, if you could please let us know how you might think these scenarios might make participants feel. And I'll give you a second to do that before I continue speaking. So when looking at these scenarios, which by the way are true, these are real things that happen. These aren't just like brain teasers that I made up. With the first one, something that was extremely interesting to me was that after folks came in to speak with this coordinator privately and respectfully, and explained that they didn't think this would be appropriate. They didn't think it would be something that the students would be comfortable with, and that also that historical experience might not be one that anybody needs, and especially Black children from low-income neighborhoods would need. There was a lot of pushback. There was an open conversation about understanding why it might be taboo, but also there were a lot of people who said that they really did see the historical value in that, and that it might be a really powerful experience for these students to sleep in a place where their ancestors likely were enslaved. They ended up not doing this, thankfully, but this is something that happened in the past 10 years. Things like this happen all the time. As a minority in the environmental field, I hear stories like this and am asked to consult and give advice on scenarios like this very often. It is very easy for your heart to be in the right place and for you to just go so wrong in a scenario like this. In the second, the university did end up taking this trip, and it was fine. Nothing bad happened, except for the fact that the students who were people of color were extremely uncomfortable. And they, of course, called their parents and told them, hey, we're on Robert E. Lee Highway. I feel extremely uncomfortable. I don't know where we're going. We're in a rural community. We don't have great cell service. And they felt unsafe. And so even though their destination was a beautiful, safe place in the outdoors where they ended up having positive experiences with nature, it is really easy for those experiences to be clouded and overshadowed in their memories by the fact that they had to drive through that community twice. And so you drive through, you get over it, you have a great trip, a great experience in the outdoors, and then you have to do it all over again and step back into that fear that is just really deep and could stick with you for a long time. Both of these scenarios are things that could have been prevented altogether there were if there was an empathy walkthrough done, if coordinators were able to stop and say, well, let me think about how I would feel if I came from this background, if I were this sort of person, and we did this, what would that make me feel like? There's a very good chance that if you were to put yourselves in the shoes of Black children from inner city Atlanta or first-year college students, that you would really quickly see that staying in a slave cabin or driving through Robert E. Lee Highway would be something that left a negative impact. And of course, as educators and community builders, the top priority is not to do the most intense hike or to have the craziest outdoor experience. It's always to build a positive experience in the outdoors so that when your programming is over, your participants are able to take that with them and build upon it themselves, and also to take it back into their community and spread the good word. Tell their community members, no, I did this thing and it was really scary at first, but I had a great experience and I would love it if you came with me next time. Oh, and there is an inclusion tip on the screen to research and visit sites first. Site visits are so important, even if it's somewhere you've been 1,000 times. You don't know how different a place might be from when you went 2 weeks ago to now. So I always strongly encourage that. Next, we're going to talk about planning for cultural differences. We've got one scenario on this screen. We're planning a series of bike rides and hikes for Sundays at noon. It's explained that it'll be great for the weekend so people can come after they finish church. And this is something that is more geared towards people of color in the South. And so thinking about this from an inclusion lens, what could be some issues that could arise with this scenario? Please share in the chat, and I'll give y'all a second to do that. So thinking from an inclusion lens, first of all, I want to state that these scenarios do not place blame on anyone, right? These are all things that have really happened in real life, but aren't coming from places of malice or anything like that, more so from opportunities to learn and grow. This scenario, the bike ride was great. The hikes were great. It was a really fun event. But in the planning process, something that came up, which was glaringly obvious for me, but not necessarily for everyone, was that if you're planning an event and you want Southern people of color to attend on Sundays, they're not going to attend. As a person of color who grew up going to church, Sundays are not a day for anything but church. Church services in the South can last for hours and hours and hours, and they're really a large community gathering, right? And so it leaves very little time to go for a hike in the afternoon or go for a bike ride, and especially not at 12 noon, right? There's no real lunch date option for a lot of Southerners who grow up in church. The inclusion tip on this screen is when planning for an event for a group, try to include or consult someone who might share their lived experiences. This was a very easy fix. Once it was stated like, hey, there probably isn't time for people to come to a bike ride at noon if they're attending church, we just switch the dates. And that's a very easy, simple thing to do, and helped us to be able to have an event that was successful and had a great turnout. I feel that it's especially important to be inclusive with youth. I think that youth, well, we know that youth are very impressionable. And so when taking youth into the outdoors for some of their first outdoor experiences, I think that there's an added level of pressure to ensure that they're having positive experiences, right? So scenarios on this screen: a city program for migrant youth wants my organization to take children out to our farm, which is 50 minutes from their classroom and in a rural area. City wants, oh, sorry, this is a second scenario. The city wants youth from a public housing community to help pick up trash in a river park. So our question here for the chat is, what should we be prepared for, and why might not these experiences feel good for the students? And again, I'll give y'all a second to respond in the chat if you'd like. So in regards to our first scenario here, this was something that was done with my organization, and it was great. There were no issues at all. Actually, it was a beautiful day. But something we had to consider in the planning process was, what do we do? So we bring a lot of groups out to our demonstration community farm in Alexander, North Carolina. It's a beautiful space. People love to be out there. And it's only about 15 or 20 minutes from Asheville proper. So it's a really good option for folks to have very first introduction to the outdoors, or kind of dipping their toe in. But something we often do when bringing folks to the farm is allowing them to participate in service projects. And this is a lot of fun. We do weeding, we plant things. Occasionally we do trainings. Recently there was a chainsaw training, and folks who participated in the training were able to help the next week in the maintenance of a reforestation area. But when approaching this, we had to think, okay, these are migrant youth. The last thing we want to do is to bring them to our farm and to put them to work, right? These are children who likely have heard all types of stories about working in the outdoors, working on industrial farms and things like that. And we don't want to put them in those shoes. We don't want them to associate the outdoors with such harsh, tough experiences. We want them to be able to know that they can come to a farm and they can come and look at a sign and learn about stream restorations, and have a good time that isn't necessarily uncomfortable in any way, and also feels like a safe space for them to come to. In our second scenario here, this was another scenario from a colleague that she considered a big whoops for her. And it was a great idea, right? Lots of different people do trash cleanups for their communities. A big way to get people to have buy-in in conservation and promoting green spaces is to give them ownership over their own communities, right? Where you're going to help plant your own community garden so you can grow your own vegetables, so you can have your own native plants, so you can grow your own medicinal plants. We're going to keep our community safe because it's your community. This is yours and you should care about it. But when taking these youth from public housing to pick up trash in a river park, a lot of feedback that she came from these predominantly Black youth was things like, I'm not a slave, and you have me out here working, and feeling like they were being likened to imprisoned folks, and how that made them feel. And so what was seen from the adult perspective as a great way to keep your community clean and something that had direct results, right? When you're giving people experiences in the outdoors, it's great to give them something they can see. They might not necessarily want to plant seeds that they'll never get to see germinate, but a public park cleanup, you instantly see the results of your work. And a lot of the kids did have fun that day. They enjoyed themselves. They got to talk. They got to be in community. But they did have to go back to the drawing board after the fact and say, okay, maybe we should have thought that through a little bit more. And maybe we should have thought about how being in this scenario would make this particular demographic feel. This is something that had been done with other youth from low income backgrounds, but who were predominantly white, and they didn't get nearly as many of the comments as the Black youth gave. And that is partially because of things that happen in low income Black communities, and also, right, that historical aspect of not wanting to be seen in a position of servitude because of how that might make you feel and how that might make you look to outsiders. A good question to ask is, can everybody participate and does everyone feel welcome? Something that is really popular in Asheville are school and community gardens. And when looking at a school or community garden, things that I look for first are infrastructure, signs, and if there's any standing curriculum. The infrastructure and community gardens can refer to a lot of different things, right? If it is a community garden, if it's open to all, does it feel welcoming? Would an outsider coming in know which way to go, know where the entrance was, know where the exit was, know what was safe to harvest and what wasn't, know when to stop harvesting things, when to leave things for other. Signage is also very important, right? Looking into our signs, who can read them? One, is it legible? I myself have terrible handwriting, and so I always have to be sure to bring someone else in to read the signs. But not only that, looking at your signage and saying, should we have translations available, right? So looking at the demographics of the community that you're serving, if you're trying to appeal to different types of people, you have to make sure that there are things in place to make it so it's accessible to those people. Something else is curriculum. As an educator, I think everything is better if you think of things from an education lens, right? It assists with communication and it assists with making sure that people take away what you would like for them to take away. This doesn't mean that your community garden or your community farm needs to have a lesson plan set out for passerbys to be able to participate in. It just means that you have set out clear expectations and clear ideal takeaways. And with your infrastructure and with your signage and other components, you've ensured that that takeaway is taken away, that people understand what you're trying to get across, that they're seeing your farm or your garden or your park or whatever as whatever type of space you would like it to be seen as. That infrastructure also obviously goes into ability. We live in a mountainous region, and so oftentimes we're working with what we have. We're in hilly areas, and that is perfectly fine. That is okay. But something that can be helpful is making sure that you have areas on your land or on your property that is accessible, right? You don't have to pave your entire trail system, but saying, okay, if we had wheelchair users coming to this area, is there a single portion of the area where they can access it and still have a fulfilling experience that you would have if you were an able-bodied person? So just keeping things like that in mind. Staff may have different levels of knowledge and experience when working with underrepresented people. This is not an issue at all, right? These are just people's lived experiences. So we've got some scenarios on the screen. We're out at a farm with a group of 20 youth of color. We finished our activities, but several kids want to take photos of the cows because they've never seen a cow before. A colleague says, come on, I'll take you. And I explain that they're not prepared with shoes, water, or clothes for a trek through a field. We've also not scouted the route for a hike, and her response is that they'll be fine. Some questions for the chat would be, why might they have done this, and what do you think happened? This is another incident where all of the adults are well-meaning, everybody is having a great time, and just needing to take that extra step to think of if it's safe and why the lead organizer of the activity might have said no to something that seems like it'll be easy and simple to do. So I will give you another second to respond in the chat if you'd like. So this scenario, which I did not see as a slight or a personal attack or anything. It's just something that happens very often when people are unfamiliar with working with people who have little experience in the outdoors, right? It takes a lot of time to build trust with these communities and a lot of time and effort to get them to step out of their comfort zone, to come out and to do an event with you. And so things that are important, I spoke earlier about always scouting and outing before you do it. This was an outing we talked about beforehand, and the adults responsible for the youth coming out and I mutually agreed that a hike was something they wouldn't be comfortable with. It was summertime and it was hot, and that we would skip it this time. But once we had got to the farm and emotions were running high and there was excitement, it was kind of written over. And because these youth were unprepared, and we were also unprepared without having scouted a hike, we ran into all types of things on the trails that we wouldn't have normally. And it actually ended up with all the youth having a really negative experience in the outdoors, which is, as I've stated earlier, the worst possible takeaway is that we build this trust and you come outside and you come out on this excursion and you leave feeling worse than when you came. And it also is very easy to unravel the trust that you've built with a group with just one negative experience. Our last scenario here is talking about remembering inclusion. In all of our events, we've talked a lot about things happening in the outdoors, but organization hosts all types of events in all different types of settings. Our scenario here is that an organization is planning their annual fundraiser. There are 4 young white coordinators who select a nice catered venue with a silent auction. Tickets are $150 per person. To access the venue, one must park several blocks away and climb a steep flight of stairs. And unfortunately, it rains this night. Some questions for the chat are: who may not be able to attend? Why might some of the organization's invited speakers not feel comfortable at the event? Why the organization's target donors arrive angry, and how this could have been solved with different planning. And in the interest of time, I will just keep going with this scenario. While you're responding in the chat, please feel free. So this event actually happened in Washington, D.C. A lot of organizations have something in common, which is many of their major donors are older people. They're retired and they are donating their time and money to causes that they really care about. When planning an event or silent auction, you have to think about your audience, right? And so these 4 able-bodied young coordinators are really excited. They love this venue, but a lot of the participants are stopped because they can't climb all the stairs. And not only that, but it starts to rain, which obviously the facilitators of this event can't help, right? It's not their fault that it started to rain for an indoor event. But if they had taken into account that already to access the event, you have to climb stone stairs, it might come into your mind like, wait a minute, would this be something that remains accessible if it rains? Is this something that is accessible to begin with for our target audience? And when planning events, right, you might want something that appeals to all. And so maybe it's hard to identify a target audience. Then comes into play an empathy walkthrough, right? What type of people might attend this event? And how can we make sure that it's successful for them, that they're comfortable, and that it's accessible? I'll give you a moment if you would like to share any of your scenario learning moments or key challenges you've encountered during programming efforts in the chat, and share your own inclusive tip for environmental work. And while you're doing that, I will show my 10 final inclusion tips. Some of these have already been stated in our presentation. Number one, I've got needs assessments, obviously plan with empathy walkthroughs, asking participants about their goals, needs, and experiences before planning an event, especially if it's kids and youth or any population that might be more impressionable or more sensitive. Two is conducting post surveys to learn for the future. This is something that I know is extremely difficult to get data after the fact, right? Because your event has happened, people are happy, they go home and they're done with it. But if you are able to conduct post surveys or build these things into your programming, I highly suggest that. Three, sharing successes with others, but also the mistakes too, right? We all make mistakes. No one is a perfect programmer. And making a mistake or a cultural faux pas does not make you a bad educator or a bad leader. It just means that there's more learning for you to do. Conducting an empathy walkthrough to gain perspectives of participants. Googling first, that includes the map, the history of a site. History is very important, especially when outdoor events, right? You don't want to take a group to a place that has a negative historical context to themselves or their culture or their community. Six, working with staff to help them consider different perspectives, right? We don't want to get frustrated when someone doesn't see something the way that we do or doesn't notice a potential issue. We want to treat that as a learning experience and open that up as a dialogue. That way we have a safe space to continue reciprocal learning. And people are also able to, again, share their mistakes and be more vocal about how they feel they could have done better. Seven is finding someone to make your materials multilingual, another level of accessibility. Eight, consider not just the educational curriculum, but the logistics. What are the barriers, whether it be travel, access, and cost? No program, right, overcomes every single barrier. So your program is not a failure if it's not 100% accessible, if it's not a low cost, if people have to travel far. But trying to mitigate these challenges and figure out ways that would work best for the community that you're trying to serve. Nine is being persistent. Being inclusive requires consistent effort and prioritization. I tell people a lot as a Black person working in the outdoors, it is no easier for myself to build a relationship with, for example, a Black community in an area that I'm not from or I'm not a part of, than it would be for a white person. I still have to be persistent. I still have a lot of unreturned emails. And I still have a lot of last minute cancellations, and that's okay. That's just a part of building community, is being patient and showing people that you're there for the right reasons, right? This group knows that I've emailed them 5 times a year for 2 years. And so maybe they know I'm not looking for a photo op, or I'm not using them to fulfill a grant requirement. I'm actually trying to get in contact because I feel that there are things that we can do to benefit each other and build a relationship. And 10, I have keep learning. I don't think anyone is ever done learning about anything, no matter what your expertise might be. I, as an inclusive environmental educator, have things to learn from all types of people, right? There's this notion sometimes that when talking about EDI or inclusivity, you need to be your voice of reason, or your main facilitator has to be a person of color, has to be a marginalized person. This is not true. You can learn from anyone, including participants in events that you're putting on. And thank you. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, comments, or concerns.
LaKyla, that's an outstanding presentation. And you have shared personally so much of yourself in doing this work. And I know it's not easy. Just see if there's some questions that come in. Jeff has asked if we're making progress with partner organizations in the community, if we feel like we're going in the right direction.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for coming. We are definitely making progress with partner organizations. As you all know, we've had a hurricane recently, and so a lot of people are just now kind of getting back to normalcy. And so at the top of the year, we've been getting a lot of inquiries from past partners and partners that we work with pretty consistently about trying to set up events and things for the coming year. So that's been going well, and there's no reason to think that momentum won't keep up.
Just give a last opportunity here for questions. And if there are none, just want to thank you again for the personal investment that you make. So we do have another question about an event that you've planned that made you feel proud of yourself and the folks who participated.
I think that is hard. I think something that I am proud of every year is the summer programming we're able to do. The summer programming is very robust and intense, and it's often just myself doing the bulk of that programming. And last summer, we were able to serve over 700 participants and take rafting outings and hiking outings. And all of those went well, and everyone left with a smile on their face, which can be really hard to do for any type of event.
We have a question about repeat events that tend to build comfort versus one-off kinds of events.
I definitely see value in repeat events. And actually, typically people say the opposite. They say the one-off events don't have as much value as repeat events. But I think a really well-executed one-off event can be just as powerful as a series of events. I still remember things like presenters who came in elementary school who came for one day and talked about something that stuck with me. And there are a lot of things I don't remember, like backpacking trips and things like that, that left way smaller impression than a one-off did. So I think it's all about the quality of the programs you're hosting.
Super. Well, want to thank everyone who's joined the webinar today, and especially LaKyla, thank you for the work you do and presenting about it. We'll make this video available on our YouTube channel for folks who want to share it with friends and others and maybe watch it again. So thank you all. If there's no more questions, I think we will say goodbye and hope you are able to join us for our next Lunch and Learn webinar down the road. Thanks,
Thanks all for
everybody.
coming.
Bye-bye.